Chemical Foundation of Life, Chapter 2, Part 4. Water is an essential molecule for life. We find that virtually every type of organism or structure that we call cell on Earth is made up of roughly 60% or even greater of water. That includes the human body. One of the molecules that scientists search for when we send spacecraft or space probes to our moon or Mars or any other planetary body or even asteroid in our solar system, often they're looking for water because that's one of, at least what we know of, is a very essential ingredient for life. Why is water important? We're going to find that water is what we call a polar molecule. It has a slight positive or negative charge over its surface, which allows it to interact with other molecules. Water can also form a very weak bond. It's called a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds are important for biological systems because since they're weak chemical bonds, they're easily broken and easily formed, thus holding pieces and parts of us together. We have 9 different properties of water that we'll discuss in this section. We can form hydrogen bonds. Those are bonds between the hydrogen on one molecule and the oxygen or nitrogen on another separate molecule. We find that one of the unique characteristics of water is that when it's in solid form, that we call ice, it's actually less dense than the liquid form. We'll talk about why that's important later. It has a high specific heat and a high heat of vaporization. Cubic millimeter per cubic millimeter, water can hold more caloric energy without changing temperature than many other kinds of molecules or materials. It is considered to be a universal biological solvent. It has properties of adhesion and cohesion that allows very large trees to gather up water from its roots and maybe even go hundreds of feet up to feed the water to the leaves at the top of the tree. It has a high surface tension and is important for many chemical reactions, especially in an organism. So here's an illustration of what a hydrogen bond looks like. It's a very generalized illustration. Each molecule of water is composed of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen. We mentioned in another section that the oxygen is a more electronegative atom than the hydrogens. So we have essentially a skew in the distribution of where the electrons will be surrounding the oxygen versus the hydrogen atoms. So we have a slight negative charge over the oxygen because of that differential in electronegativity, and a slight positive charge around the hydrogen atoms. That's why we're using the lowercase d, or delta, with a plus or a minus, to show us a weak positive or a weak negative charge. Those weak positive and negative charges on one water molecule allows it to be attracted to, again, very weakly, to a neighboring water molecule and form a hydrogen bond between the hydrogen of one to the oxygen of its neighbor. Hydrogen bonds are generally depicted as dotted lines in comparison to covalent bonds, which are illustrated with a solid line. If we take a look at some of the other properties of water, it's often the hydrogen bond that's responsible for many of the properties on our list of why water is important. Water can not only form hydrogen bonds between other water molecules, but it also forms hydrogen bonds with other ions and other atoms. Notice here we have an ion of chloride and an ion of sodium. Sodium chloride is common table salt. You probably or should know that if you take table salt in the crystalline form and you mix it with water, it will dissolve. Well, that's because sodium chloride is held together by ionic bonds. Remember, ionic bonds means one atom lost an electron, another atom gained the electron. So these atoms are not covalently tied together or linked together. Instead, we're going to have these positive and negative attractions between these ions. And the same is going to be true for the polar, slightly positive, slightly negatively charged water molecules surrounding these ions. Those different portions of each individual molecule of water will also be attracted to its oppositely charged ion of sodium or chloride. So notice on the left, the slightly positively charged hydrogens on each molecule of water are attracted to or hydrogen bonded to the chloride negatively charged ion, in contrast to the opposite side, or the right side of the picture, where we have, again, 3 molecules of water with the slight negatively charged oxygens attracted to or hydrogen bonded to the sodium. Well, they're not really hydrogen bonds, so to speak, but these are polar attractions. And so even though it might not technically be hydrogen bonding with these ions, it is a polar attraction with these ions and can also occur with polar molecules. For the 3 states of water, water can be found in the form of a gas, which we call steam or water vapor, liquid, and a solid, which we call ice. The solid has a crystalline structure, and believe it or not, when scientists evaluate the location and the placement of different water molecules in, let's say, a cube of ice, compared to the same volume of water, or the same amount of water, the water molecules in a cube of ice are actually separated or further apart. And that's part of why a cube of ice is less dense than essentially the same volume of liquid water, where the molecules are closer together, so that's a little bit more dense. It's important that ice is less dense, or in other words, floats on top of liquid water, particularly in the wintertime, when ponds or lakes or rivers freeze. The freezing of the water will occur at the surface, but not from the bottom up. We really wouldn't have any organisms surviving over the winter if ice formed and it was more dense than liquid water, because we'd find that the ponds and rivers would freeze starting at the bottom and then going up to the top. Whereas if we have ice floating and forming at the top of those pools of water, that means some of the little critters that are below the surface of the ice and in the greater depths of those sources of water can sort of find a safe haven and overwinter until the ice thaws and temperatures get warmer. So it really has been a benefit for organisms on Earth that solid frozen water, ice, is less dense than liquid water. For hydrogen bonding, we see an illustration of the crystalline arrangement we call a lattice. So a crystalline structure can also be called a lattice work. Kind of this lacy, you can see lots of space between the different molecules, and that's part of what we'd see if we could visualize the individual components or the individual molecules of water in a piece of solid frozen ice. For high specific heat, gram for gram, water can absorb more heat energy without changing temperature. That's important if you have a landmass near a large body of water, or even a small body of water. Temperatures can be moderated over the surface of the land if we have a body of water close by, because during the day, the heat energy is absorbed by the water in a pond or a lake. Very little change perhaps in the temperature of the water itself, but then at night, slowly that heat energy is released to the surrounding environment, which means a lake or a pond can serve as essentially a source of a heat sink, if you will. A place where caloric heat energy can be stored during the day and slowly released at night to keep the temperatures moderated in the surrounding area. So the fact that that temperature can be sort of moderate but still have a tremendous amount of heat energy trapped in that body of water, it has been an important feature for organisms occurring and growing here on Earth. For a high heat of vaporization, it's somewhat similar to what we just talked about for retaining heat energy, because water, again, can absorb or retain an incredible amount of caloric heat energy in liquid form before it turns into a gas. If you've ever been exposed to steam heat, you'll realize that it's very hot, and it doesn't take much of an exposure to steam heat to cause a burn on your skin. The reason the steam heat or the steam vapors can cause such a burn so quickly is, again, because that steam has been produced by a unit or a cupful or a liter full of water that absorbed an incredible amount of heat energy, and it isn't really released until that transformation occurs from liquid to water vapor in the form of steam. Now, sometimes we have water vapor that's produced that is released when a moderate amount of caloric heat energy is absorbed. And of course, that's when we see condensation on windows or other places in our work environment. That lower temperature condensation still means that that water absorbed the caloric energy, released some water in the form of a gas, but it hadn't reached that really high temperature steam heat that we might associate with a steam burn, or let's say a tea kettle or a coffee pot that's brewing. Ions and polar molecules can dissolve in water because of the polar nature of water itself. That means that water is a great universal biological solvent, because pretty much any kind of structure that we find in the formation of organisms, especially the very important interactive molecules, are going to have some kind of polar nature. There are some exceptions, and those exceptions that we call nonpolar molecules also are going to take advantage of interacting with polar molecules. We'll talk about that more when we describe cell membranes later on in the semester. So water as a universal biological solvent, and the fact that we have a wide variety of ions and polar molecules that can dissolve or be mixed or suspended in water. The water is going to be called the solvent. That's the liquid in which we're mixing something called the solute. The solute will be the chemicals like sodium chloride or sugars or proteins. When you mix a solute, which is the chemical, in a solvent, which is the liquid, then we say we have a solution. A solution in biology or in chemistry, we're talking about not finding the solution to a math problem. A solution in a biological system, again, is a liquid in which some kind of solute has been mixed with a solvent. For the adhesion and cohesion properties of water, we can see the advantage in the formation of adhesion of water molecules if we take a little thin, narrow, tiny glass capillary tube, place it in a beaker of water, and we will see some of that water will be pulled up the glass tube without suctioning or without any extra effort to try and raise the level of the water in the little glass capillary tube. The reason the water exceeds the surface of the water that's in the cup or the beaker is due to capillary action because of adhesion. The water molecules actually are attracted to the inner surface of the glass and are pulled up by what we call capillary action or adhesion along the inner surface of the glass tube. That in addition to cohesion. So cohesion is based on the hydrogen bonding between the water molecules. That's why a drop of water looks exactly like this photo. It's all held together in a nice little uniform droplet or bead. And when you use those two together, cohesion and adhesion, then we can find a third characteristic called surface tension is used by quite a few biological systems and takes advantage of what you might think of as maybe kind of like the stickiness of water, even though it really isn't sticky. So adhesion allows water molecules to interact with surfaces and kind of pull the water up along surfaces. Cohesion means the water stays together in a nice uniform little or large arrangement. And then surface tension means that the adhesion and the cohesion are holding that water together, and items could possibly sort of not float, but settle on the surface and not sink. So here we have a metal needle. Now a metal needle, if you were to place that on or in a liter or so or beaker of water, depending on how you placed it on the water, it might sink. If you're very careful and you place it gently on the surface of the water in the beaker, you might find that you are not disrupting the water molecules, but instead you're relying on the cohesion and adhesion just enough so that the needle just lays on the surface. It has a high surface tension. It's kind of stretchy. Some insects take advantage of this high surface tension and scoot along the surface of a pond or a lake looking for food or looking for other little insects by relying on this high surface tension so that the surface of the water is a little bit on the stretchy side before you disrupt the surface and wind up sinking to the bottom of the pond. And here's an illustration of exactly that kind of insect. It's often described as a water strider. You might have seen these on a lake or a pond, where the insect has these long little pointy feet and would essentially sink in, except that surface tension is taking advantage of it and scooting along the surface. Taking advantage of capillary action of adhesion and cohesion, we can get that water to the top of a tree. Water is used in chemical reactions that we call dehydration and hydrolysis, or hydration reactions. Notice we have what we call monomers, which are building blocks. When we cause hydrogen bonds to form between these two separate monomers, we're going to release a molecule of water in every step along the chemical reaction.